Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm your host, Alexander F., and today we are certainly esoterically elated to be talking about the Song of the Dark Man with author and esotericist Dara Mason. Now, listeners, you might be asking yourself, who or actually what is the Dark Man? Known by many names throughout the centuries, monikers such as the Devil, Old Scratch, the Dark Rider, the Old One, the Master, the Father of Witches, and many more appellations. Is the Dark Man really pure evil, as many modern religions might postulate? Is the Dark Man a catalyst of novelty, of transformation, of inspiration and change? How can we engage with this powerful presence? And what happens when we resist the call of the Dark Man? Well, Dara Mason, of course, is the perfect person to ask. I know so many of you listeners are familiar with Dara, who is a writer, a researcher, an award-winning travel and documentary photographer, and the proprietor of the award-nominated podcast Spirit Box. And in addition to all of that, Dara is also the co-creator of the Sigil Engine, a technomantic art project, among many other interests, areas of research, and projects. And Dara is based in East Sussex in the United Kingdom. Dara's latest tome, entitled, which is such a wonderful, wonderful tome, Song of the Dark Man. It is fascinating, as we'll get into, because it breaks so many stereotypes about this mysterious figure while drawing on the manuscript tradition found in Ireland and elsewhere, as well as witch trial records stretching back centuries. So now to help us uncork the uncommon, I am so excited to welcome yourself, Dara Mason. Thank you for just stopping by the podcast today.
It's an absolute pleasure and a real honor to be here. So thank you for having me.
Honor is absolutely mine, Dara. I've been a fan of yours for many years, and we were just chatting quickly before the podcast. This is wonderful. It is so well researched. It is so well written. It immediately lassos you in. It captivates your interests, and it pulls you in two different parts of the book that we'll certainly get into in just a bit, Dara. And I know that, of course, many listeners are familiar with you, but for the one or two people out there who might not be, can you give us just some of the broad strokes about your early background and just how you first became interested in esotericism, in pushing the boundaries of the veil, so to speak? How did this all start for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those questions that comes up a fair bit in this area, isn't it? About kind of like, when did you start being so weird? The more I kind of think about it, is I think it was kind of always leaned this way, always had this type of interest. Like when I was a young kid, I used to have kind of like Dungeons and Dragons sets and kind of like, kind of supporting magazines. So I had a little corner of my room at a writing desk that I'd covered in kind of, pictures of like illustrations of Dungeons and Dragons scenes. But I had this little writing table, and to make it more kind of like an alchemist's corner, and I was about maybe 7 or 8, I covered it in a black cloth. Right, and had these little mini candelabras on, and I look back at that now, and I go, "That was like a little black altar," like it was like my Fisher Price version of kind of creating kind of a magical space. So, I look back at that, and I kind of think there's an instinctual element of kind of what would manifest later in life. I think a lot of people have that kind of stuff. Certainly started kind of meditating and doing kind of like going into vision and all that kind of stuff when I was around in my early teens, using pendulums, all that kind of stuff. But I was very solitary for many years. I really didn't kind of get involved with groups, and I was in an awful lot of communities and groups. And it really kind of happened after I kind of presented some of my photographic work at Treadwell's in London. Oh gosh, 2016, 2017, something like that. Some of my photographic work when I was a travel documentary photographer. Again, I leaned into that kind of esoteric kind of more kind of fringe spirituality stuff. I shot essays on the Hindu sect, the Agori. I shot an essay tracking down kind of all the major locations associated with the jinn in William Dalrymple's book, City of Jinns, and in Delhi. I had a fair few weird things happen when I was doing that. And I kind of had these lectures kind of that I'd prepared to support those pieces, and I stuck them on YouTube, and it kind of went from there. But at the same time, with Treadwells, I got exposed to the magical community, and kind of began to get peers, and kind of it's snowballed from there, really, you know. But
It's incredible.
yeah, been at it for a while.
You've certainly been going where I think few people in your photography work and your work with the gin and documenting things. It's fascinating, Dara. I mean, it's. I was just telling you, gosh, I could chat with you for hours about the gin alone. And oh, so here you are from initial black altars many years ago, and just kind of getting these fingerprints
Yeah.
to now literally being a journeying through the esoteric world. Okay, so and you touch on this in the book as well. Let's talk a little bit about the Dark Man, and I love this in the book. And listeners, check out the links below. Pick up your own copy if you do not have it already. It's 100% something that will expand your consciousness. You say that so many people want to ask you who is the Dark Man, but you mentioned this is wrong from the start. And so instead, can you tell us about the patterns of the Dark Man and what is the Dark Man?
Yeah. And the reason I frame it that way is the minute we start getting into labeling, we start to kind of fall into a kind of a human mindset. There's a human instinct to label. That is a thing. It has these attributes. That's what it is. But then it isn't. It isn't another thing. So it's like, that's the chair. It's not the table. So we have to kind of not ask that question who, because we'll fall into that trap straight away. But also we're talking about a force here, like it's an inspirational, disruptive force. It has no singular name or form. There are no kind of formal canonized texts. But what we do have are these shared characteristics. We have overlapping mythologies, and we can find these fragments in folklore and in witch trials and mythologies, and we can kind of piece those together. But also, we can find this force in people's lives, in how their lives have been interrupted when they've got the call, as it were, that I speak to in the book. One of the things that I think is quite important when we think about what the Dark Man does and what it kind of what the force instigates in people. Now, I say it's the father of witches, right? But I also say it's the song of the Dark Man, and I use song very, very specifically because it has a creative pulse. There is as much as we say the father of witches, there is equally a relationship with people who are highly creative, right? It's the same thing, or it's a variation of it. And that's quite noticeable because when we talk about kind of folklore, when we talk about mythologies, these things were performed. We're in an era where we tend to read folklore. We tend to kind of pick up a book and read through it. But that's not how those stories were imparted. They were sung, they were acted, they were passionately recounted. It was a very different way to receive those stories. And equally, we talk about kind of dance and singing and music, all these things, they have an aspect to it that is the kind of the touch of the dark man. Kind of famously, the devil has the best songs, all that kind of stuff. So it's if we start kind of sticking a label on and going, it is this thing, it is the devil, we miss all this other stuff. It's extremely complex. And Robin Ardison, the kind of the witch, speaks to this, and kind of, he and I quote him in the book. He basically says, kind of, the name as a label is a trap, and the minute you think you have what the master, quote unquote, is, he'll slip through the net. So there's many names, and it's by characteristics. That's kind of what I zeroed in, and what you've asked me about. It's characteristics that we note, and where I saw a pattern is where I kind of started to kind of recognize there were kind of discernible characteristics, and I'm sure there's more, but what I noted initially was there is a dark appearance or appellation, and there is a trickster or interceptor type quality. So by interceptor, I mean it's a normal sequence of events is interrupted. So that kind of a walk home at night is interrupted. A journey in a car is interrupted. Right. There's also a shape-shifting quality that comes up again and again, and ties into that kind of, there's no form, right? You can have whatever form it wants. And there's also what I call it the composite being. So it manifests in part human, part animal, part multiple animal, that kind of thing. So a therianthropic form. And then the other bit is sex or an interest in human sexuality, sometimes in the most literal way. And so those are the characteristics that came up in the stories, in the folklore, and were almost mirrored very, very closely, if not like for like, in the accounts of British, principally Scottish, witchcraft trial material.
I love that. I cannot wait to chat with you and get more in depth on all of these various facets that you've just delineated on the Dark Man. And one of those that you've touched on so well in the book, in addition to all of those, is this element, as you said, of this paradoxical figure, that blew me away, because I came in, and this is why, one of many reasons why I'm so thankful for your book, Song of the Dark Man, because it really challenged me. It challenged, to break stereotypes that I had, just coming into it about what is this figure. And I realized just how absolutely little, I know, and many of us know. And I think this leads, Dara, to when listeners get their own copy of the book, if they don't have it already, the great Peter Mark Adams, writes in the foreword to your book about this theme that the Dark Man is, quote, as you said, quote, a trickster-like being who appears to occupy a tidal zone of meaning, one that pools, surges, and abates at obtuse angles to our daily lives. So can you share, Dara, about this element of paradox and kind of having two, or holding two seemingly contradictory things at the same time? What is this about when it comes to paradox of the Dark Man?
Yeah. I mean, firstly, what a wonderful line by Peter.
Oh, yeah.
He's so good. But so I think a lot of the paradox stuff leans into two principal areas. So the one is around non-duality, right? And that's the big side of it, right? And the other kind of paradoxical element, and I kind of talk to this in the book of like, well, in a very broad sense, most of the representations that are described in the book, we talk about kind of a figure that is, one would say from an Abrahamic prism, is evil. Okay, right. Now, the point I make with this is that doesn't play out, right? Certainly doesn't play out 100% that way. Um, and that's the paradox, right? So, but it presents in a way that's absolutely terrifying. So we have that kind of like therianthropic, part human, part animal, but also you have the experience of like these dark figures, a dark figure appearing in your room. You know, I talk about one account of a family in Ireland, in a modern family, talking about seeing a dark figure looking into the window. You know, and sometimes it would appear partially white. Now, what you'll note with a lot of the stories, and what you'll note with some of the appearances or depictions, is you'll see things like a reference in some way to white and black, and sometimes that might be oblique, right? So, for example, this family described the figure staring in the window, and that seemed to be partially white. And incidentally, when they first spotted that figure, they interrupted their journey while they were walking through a forest, right? So this stuff, you start to see the pattern, right? It starts to stack. But anyway, um, ultimately, what we're talking about here is not something that I 100% can say is it's evil. It is a transformative force, right? It is it is making sure the apple cart is always upset, right? You know, and that's what I mean when I say it's an inspirational force. When you get new art, new music, you know, you get these kind of creative vanguards that are almost kind of like these, you know, apertures for novelty to come into the world. You know, when you think of like, you know, things like in the music industry where you've got like these incredible young artists that create an amazing volume of work, but sometimes, you know, they've a high price to pay for that. You know, like 27 Club, you know, where people die young, like, and that's where this force is dangerous as well. You know, not kind of no, not sugarcoating it is. You know, it's something that has to be managed. You know, and understood. Um, you know, from a magical perspective, it's like, you know, you skip all the kind of elemental and planetary work and you go straight into some kind of, you know, you go straight to the abyss without going through everything else in the tree of life, you know. So some people are going through those types of experiences. So they have to learn how to manage that. The body has to learn how to field that kind of energy if it's going through them. That's why a lot of people have self-medication issues, right? You know, so that's kind of one aspect to it, but ultimately it's causing change. You know, it's ensuring that orthodoxy does not have a kind of a stranglehold on the world. You know, and I often think about it this way: if you look at kind of what some of the accounts of witches, what they were talking about in kind of in like the 15th, 16th century in Britain, you know, they were getting medical cures from the dark man. You know, like, and if you were put yourself in the position, if you're like a subsistence farmer, you know, living somewhere in kind of like in the Scottish Highlands, life is going to be really hard. You know, like it's a difficult climate without modernity there. That's a very hard place to live. You know, on top of that, you've got uh, high levels of taxation and rent on land and literally kind of monocropping to survive. So if one thing goes wrong, you know, people die. You know, that's it. So how I kind of phrase that kind of or frame that kind of life is that, you know, people, you know, pray to God for salvation, but to the devil to survive, you know, like a slightly kind of dual practice type thing. We see this kind of dual practice quite a lot in that kind of British and Irish peasantry. But getting back to the paradoxical bit, it it's one of these things that's kind of it's appears in this way to be malignant, you know, and for some people that may be the case, but there seems to be kind of a purpose to that, because if this shocking figure appears in someone's life, it's going to kind of crack their reality. So it's an ontological shock. I know we'll talk about kind of what my experience later, but that's, from my experience, it's an ontological shock. It's not something you can't mentally acrobatic your way out of it, you know, to rationalize it. And but duality is the big bit. So we'll see kind of in the stories where you'll have like the puka, which is a specific type of kind of Irish supernatural being, which I think is related to it in some form. Sometimes it appears as black, sometimes it appears as white, sometimes it appears as both. It's got a fine set of horns, but the black and the white is talking about that cosmic play between opposing forces, right? What we know about the dark man, if we think about it in terms of Lucifer, so Lucifer is this dark fallen angel, yet he's the light bringer. He's the illuminator. When we have in Irish mythology, we have the kind of the big kind of standoff is between on Far Durka or on Far Dove, which is the Gaelic for the dark man, or the black man is what it's referring to, against Finn MacCool, right? So Fionn is, I guess, to help orientate people, is probably like the Irish Arthur to a degree, right? And he leads the Fianna, who are these kind of band of warriors. But we'll get back to that later. But they have a kind of a back and forth, and the Dark Man only appears briefly in his life, but it sets a whole chain of events off. But Fionn's name means fair, white, right? So you've got dark and white, right, in this dance, and in that dance is what creates something new. And we'll get to what it does create, but that happens again and again. Like Gwyn ap Nudd, the kind of the Welsh psychopomp, who I would say is an expression of the dark man as well. We have the same type of themes that come up again and again. It's extraordinary. Yeah. And some of these, that's the thing about this as well that I find particularly interesting, is that once you kind of get a sense of that, it's like it becomes really kind of like obvious. It's not that subtle, we're like a lot of it, but like some of it's hidden in language.
Yes, and that's what I love about, and I look forward to chatting and kind of getting more in depth into all of those themes that you've traced out. And speaking of language, I love the way that you write, and it is so captivating. I mean, even just now, right? Apertures of novelty. I'm taking notes. It's an ontological shock. One of the phrases that you have in the book that continues to haunt me is talking about the cave and the womb and this quote cold furnace of creation. That's just. I mean, so excellent. Something straight out of Milton. And then, of course, we can get into Finn MacCool. But speaking of language and writing, your book grabs you and it just captivates the reader from beginning to end. And that starts with your writing. It starts with Peter Mark Adams' writing. I mean, both of you are so great. Can you just share really quick in terms of working with Peter Mark Adams? How was that? How did you two collaborate on this project? How did he decide to get involved?
No, it was actually I had just recorded an interview with him. I think it was on his energy healing book. And we were just kind of briefly chatting afterwards after we kind of stopped recording. He was telling me about the Hagia Sophia book that he was then kind of working on for Scarlet Imprint. And I mentioned to him that I was contemplating kind of I think at the time I was still kind of thinking about two projects. So one, I was thinking about kind of maybe doing a collation of essays with supportive photographic work of kind of like of my best stuff, and then there was this other idea of the Dark Man, and at that time was really kind of scraps of paper in a notebook, and he asked me, oh, okay, what's, tell me a bit more about that. And I was like, well, I noticed it in the folklore and kind of, it comes up in kind of fairy stories a lot. And then I started interviewing kind of various different people, and they started mentioning kind of like I had a vision of this black man, this man in black, or the dark man, and like Aidan Wachter in his first show with me, we were about half an hour in, and he's like, "Yeah, I was wondering whether or not to be a magician. Then I saw the man in black, and he zapped me, and kind of that was it. So basically, from the very start of my show, it had always kind of been there, lurking, waiting for the time to step forward. But so I mentioned this to Peter, and he's like, that sounds really interesting, and kind of gave me a couple of pointers. Have a look at some of the some of this work and some of that work, and see if you find anything interesting in it. And that was that. And then maybe kind of a year later, or maybe 18 months later, I had been working for a while on kind of processing the kind of my experience. And I've been working with a friend of mine who was deeply psychic, Michelle DeVazis. And she kind of does that with people now. So people who kind of have these experiences, like helps kind of work with them to get through it in terms of what's going on, and get into the root of it. So anyway, I get this. I was walking back from a workplace, and I was thinking, maybe I should ask Peter if he'd do the introduction for me, and then literally at that moment, my phone went, and it was a voicemail from Michelle going, "You should ask that Saturn guy. I think he'd do a good intro for you." So I'm like, okay, well, I've just got my bell rung. So I dropped Peter an email, and he said he'd be delighted to, and to send the material through as it was coming. So, but he was also really kind of really instructive. Like, he gave me an awful lot of mentoring, and very gently as well. Like kind of like, you try and develop that bit, or he certainly kind of was instructive around time. I kind of grossly underestimated the amount of time it would take. So he kind of helped me with kind of being realistic. But part of the way through, he did say to me kind of like, "Why did you ask me to do this?" And I was like, I was kind of steered that way. Obviously, I got the idea, and then kind of to hammer it home, kind of, my psychic friend mentioned it. He's like, "Oh, okay. And I was like, "Well, why did you say yes?" And he was like, "It's pretty much the same." So, it's just one of those things. But we've done a couple of bits, since then. I've done some kind of video and kind of film work, and I've no doubt we'll do some more work together for sure.
That's so wonderful. And that's something, listeners, I know you'll appreciate so much, is when you read your book, Dara, I'm just blown away, because it's like, again and again, listening for the call. And then all of a sudden you start to schedule your own coincidences, like there's certain
Yeah.
things that happen. Right. And
Yeah.
I'm so excited to discuss that with you. Let me ask you this too, because you mentioned a few times now about the importance of folklore, and how, especially in modern days, we have this very passive attitude towards folklore and different tales, oh yes, those are some quaint things from the past. But now on social media, there's this new thing, and you shatter that. When people read your book, you get this immediate sense of the connection and timelessness of folklore as it relates to our very day here. So can you tell us, just give us, we're going to get in, as you mentioned, Dara, some, Finn MacCool and some of the other specific tales, but overall, what is the importance, and why is folklore so important as a repository for what you call, quote, these nameless remnants of dreamtime memories that preserve the universal truths? Can you just sketch that out for us?
Yeah, absolutely. It's how I look at it is, say we have kind of like, like timeline narrative based history, right, to tell the story of a place, right. It's rarely the truth, but folklore is has a similar function, but it works in a very different way. And how I kind of describe it as being is like the dream history of a place, you know, right? Because it has space for symbolism, it has space for the other, it has space for, you know, incredible experiences, for kind of multi-layered realities, and for worlds layered upon worlds, you know, and and it gives life to places in a way that kind of um, a, a semantic way of looking at a place doesn't, you know. So that's what I think of folklore, you know, and it changes how you perceive a place. Like, for, you know, for example, you see a big stone lying up in a field somewhere, and it's like, well, it's just a big stone, whatever, you know. But then the storyteller of the town tells you, up at that stone there was a battle, you know, and actually that's the head of the giant, you know, that was slain, and his head turned to stone, and all that kind of stuff, you know. Like it gives magic and depth to the time of a place, you know, and can bring alive those types of stories. Like there's a place near where my folks live back in Ireland, and it's a small crossroads of a village, right? And it's called Ahargour. And there's a guy who was on my show a while back, and he's going through folklore and through old bodies of text, looking for references to lifting stones. Okay, so these are stones that are used to feat of strength to lift these stones, and there's one in Ahargour, right? And it's said to be the giant stone, right? So I went to see it, and it's like these things are like over 100 kilograms, like big things. Some of them are just ridiculous. Like, but Dave McCown is the guy's name, and he's like lifting these big things up, right? But it's a pre-famine tradition, the stone lifting. Okay, so it died out after the famine. I mean, the Irish people pre-famine were some of the biggest in Europe. You know, they were the kind of the epigenetic effect of famine shrunk them for generations. But this tradition is coming back because people are finding it in the folklore and bringing it back. But this stone is known as the giant stone, and it's got four grooves on it. These four grooves on it, and the story is it's like it was lifted by a giant who applied so much pressure, his fingerprints are burned into the stone, you know. But what's telling you about is that if you can lift that stone, you have the strength of a giant, you know. And it adds a layer of kind of heroism and kind of and mythology and mystery on top of it, you know. And that's what I mean by folklore. It has the soul of a place in it, the dreams of a place in it, and links you back into deep antiquity. It's wonderful, you know. But equally, the difference is it's a living thing, you know, and like we're still creating it now, you know. But you can go and see that stone, you know. That's what I mean. It's a living thing. You can go to the places that are described in the mythologies of the Fenians, the Fenian cycle, you know. Like these places are still there. They're readily accessible. So that's what's special about folklore is you can stand in the plain of the second battle of Moytura between the Tuatha De Danann and the Fomorians. Like those places are still there, you know. Um, so yeah, that's what I mean by folklore is it's special. It can bring you to a different place, like a magical place, and it's it has more than the sum of the language in it.
Yes. And that's something I think you are just you do so well in the book is you have this call to listen, of course, to the call and the song of the dark men, but it's also a call as I read it to, you know, understand and re-enchant your day-to-day
Yes.
life, your
Yeah.
practice, and everything else.
Mhm.
And I think, Dara, your point about folklore is so great because it overturns a lot of the misconceptions, preconceptions, things that people have. And speaking of folklore, to what you just brought up, Dara, we do have a listener question for you from Ana Victoria Esquivel, and she's asking and saying, there are countless sources, even within the magical traditions, that claim that the role of demons and especially the devil is to corrupt. Speaking of overturning stereotypes, and Anna's asking, however, in
Mhm.
my own testimonial of crossing paths with this entity, I experienced the instigator of change, quote unquote, and self
Mhm.
empowering awakening without a hint of evil. So Anna's asking, Dara, why is it then that there's so much emphasis on the corrupting aspect of the
Mhm.
devil? And supposing this aspect is also a reality, why illuminate some and corrupt others? I struggle a lot with the light bringer slash soul dammer reputation of this entity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think she's bang over the target with that. That's certainly would reflect my experience. Um, I think I think there might be two, or probably more aspects to the whole kind of idea of the corrupter. Okay, so I think the first part to it is this is a difficult experience, right? Because you're going through transformation, you're going to hurt. All right, it's not going to be easy, because generally, when we go to a transformation to be something else, to be hopefully a better version, or something that's achieving something that might be part of your fate, um, you usually have to kind of go through bits of your character that aren't great. So when you say shadow work, right? you know you might have to face into one's personal demons, um and like I mentioned earlier, like a lot of highly creative people have significant demons, like and sometimes facing into those demons is not going to go well, and I think that's part of the corrupting, is that if it goes wrong, which it can go wrong, you know, people might not make it through, they might not make it through that transformation in a way that's beneficial to them. It can be brutal. And the other thing about this is that we can't presuppose human morality on this kind of entity. It probably has no understanding of what it means to be human. So hence kind of why that is a rough journey. I certainly had my bumps in the road with it for sure, you know. But the other side of it is I mean, and I don't want to kind of give Abrahamic religions too much of a kicking, but like there was a certain amount of kind of there's only room for kind of one star of the show, really, like but equally, if you look at um a lot of kind of religious studies, there's some kind of minor texts in lesser known texts within Islam, for example, where Iblis is asked why is he set out to kind of destroy everything that Allah creates for man. Or why wouldn't you bow to Adam, which Allah instructs the host of angels to do. Iblis, not being an angel but being an elevated jinn, refuses to bow, and he says, I could not bow to anything that isn't Allah. So he's like, I'm the ultimate monotheist. You know, there's that kind of aspect to it, but equally, we also have lots of religions that have any supernatural experience that isn't sanctioned by the church, or by an imam, is said to be evil, right? So I think there's a certain amount of aspect of that there, you know. Um, that's pure speculation, but my experience would be very similar. you know um I think that corrupting force is probably got a lot to do with what's inside of us as individuals.
It's a very powerful call. I really appreciate you sharing that, Dara, because again, and this is a theme throughout your book, is it's I think challenging a lot of us to consider the paradoxical, the trickster, the uniting of the opposites, the call to effectively being an enzyme for radical transformation, and
Mm.
not resisting that. And I know we're going to get a little bit in terms of what are some of the risks that you outline in the book for resisting that change and what could happen. To stick on this theme, though, Dara, that you just touched on about that intersection between kind of institutionalized religious beliefs and the prejudices that they put on the concept, on the
Yeah.
pattern of the dark man. You do such an amazing job in the book going into the history and the manuscript tradition, and we're gonna get into that. But can you share about this fascinating connection? Speaking of history, that
Yeah.
you draw between witches, fairies, and the dark man, and so many things just really immediately stuck out for
Mm.
me. But including like the 1590s witch trial of the Scottish witch Androman, or Biddy Early
Mhm.
from County Clare in
Yeah.
the 1800s in Ireland. I mean, can you share with us about this fascinating connection?
Yeah. I mean, this is an extraordinary thing about the whole kind of the dark man pattern is like when people go, is this the devil? It's like, well, it's the folkloric devil,
Mhm.
but it's also the king of the fairies. It's also the lord of the dead. You know, it's there's so much there. So when I first kind of started getting back into Irish fairy lore, and this is kind of after I kind of had done a lot of study on the jinn when I'd come back from kind of various travels in India. Weirdly, kind of the jinn brought me back to Ireland, and going back through Irish folklore. Um, because I was reading all this jinn stuff, and I was like, "This is really like fairies." It's like there's so many common things, and now I'm kind of what 8 years past that point, and I'm like, yeah, they're local versions of probably the same thing. I mean, down to like minute examples, right? So, like, there's a book called "Living with Jinns" by Dr. Barbara Dreiskens, I think is her name, and it talks about a specific event where a a kind of a woman in Cairo is throwing dirty water out of the house into the street, and she doesn't say a version of kind of Bismillah, look out, right? Which is to warn any unseen things there that there's rubbish coming to get out of the way, so she doesn't strike anything and incur their wrath, right? And there's a whole kind of scenario that unfolds from that particular story where the last thing she saw was a black dog, which is kind of famously a kind of how jinn may appear, but she doesn't give this warning, and she's struck blind, and it takes like 3 exorcisms and 4 months to get her sight back. Now, I was reading the local newspaper back at home in Mayo, and the Western People, and I was talking about fairies in County Mayo, and how one of the traditions would be when you're throwing dirty water out of the house, you would give a quick expression to the fairies so you wouldn't strike them, right? And it was like, higu, higu, ishka salak chalk, right? So it'd be like, look out, dirty water is coming, okay? And one woman didn't do that, and the story was her face, she woke up and her face was on the back of her head, right? That the following morning, right? So like you've got like granular, like quite specific details like that, almost identical taboos. You also have association with treasure, association with underground places, association with child taking, changelings. Biddy Early, for example, was said to be taken by the fairies. You know, you have association with runes, Like, so the old stone circles in Ireland and cairns said to be places of the fairies, similar with places in the Middle East. And there's jinn travel in the wind, fairies travel in the Gihashi, the fairy wind. So it's very much the same things. Um, but they have kind of cultural specificity in a lot of places. Also, jinns will take a human lover. Fairies will take a human lover. So like the she means fairy. Okay, so banshee means woman fairy, right? Giha means fairy wind. Lannan means fairy lover, right? So same things. And jinn were notoriously jealous if that thing happens to individuals. Anyway, so huge similarity. Anyway, cut a long story short, that brought me back to Ireland and reading through the lore. And one theme that kept coming up in stories was this dark interceptor, right? So we'll come up in fairy stories of like this slightly devilish figure who would ride a black horse and dressed in kind of like uh, finery, they call it the gentry, right? Um, who would meet someone along the road and challenge them to a race or kind of wager them in some way, right? And invariably they'd be tested in some way. They get the test of metal, and that might be. There's one story where a guy called Mr. Kerwin is taking his horse to race, or he's training his horse to race, and he meets this kind of dark stranger who basically says, I favor your family. And he's Finvara, he's the king of the fairies. I favor your family. But he's displaying all the characteristics of the dark man. And I'll to help you, you can borrow I'll a jockey for you to ride your horse. So this jockey turns up and he's kind of described as being very petite and kind of quite particular looking. And the insinuation is he's some sort of fairy. So he rides the horse and rides it perfectly. And then he wins the silver cup for Mr. Kerwin. And to celebrate, he invites Mr. Kerwin, not the jockey, but the Lord, right? Invites him to his castle or his manor to feast. He's having a great time, and all the finery and people are dancing and making merry. And then he notices a woman. She's strikingly beautiful, and he's like, "Who is that?" She looks familiar, and then he dances with her, and she says, "You remember me?" And he remembers her. It's his long lost love who was killed when they were engaged 25 years ago, right? She's pale, so he's in the land of the dead, right? And she gives him like a bracelet which burns his wrist, and he wears that scar for the rest of his life. But he's kind of stricken with like, what? Oh my God, this is some? I'm in the land of the dead with the fairy king. All right, and he like throws the silver cup into the lake and kind of never speaks of it again, and kind of that kind of thing, right? So in the stories, we have this total merging of the Lord of the Dead, the psychopompic figure, the king of the fairies, and this folkloric devil. Like they are not separate at all. They merge all the time, you know. But in the witch trials, you have very similar things. So in the Confessions of Isabel Gowdy, she talks about one of the things that they did on the devil's behalf was shooting elf darts, shooting fairy darts at people, which would strike them and kill them. In this chaotic force that they would then embody, they would kind of impart that chaos into the community, sometimes quite malefically. But the darts were made by these fairies that were in the pay of Black John, of the devil. So they're hugely intertwined. And one of the figures that I talked to in the mythology, a figure called Dondov, is the Lord of the Dead, right? But he has again the same characteristics. So these weren't separated in people's minds at all, but we're very much merged, you know. But yeah, Biddy Early was probably the most famous witch in Ireland in the 1800s, and she was famed for making medicines in these green bottle medicines that she'd. Someone would come to them with an affliction, and she'd make this concoction, and they'd drink it, and then, or sometimes she'd take the illness out of people and bottle it and throw it into the lake near her house. Famously, priests would go to her to get cures. I'm hoping to go to the ruins of her home actually in a couple of weeks. In Clare now, when I'm back in Ireland. But there's a big body of work. Her Eddie Lenihan, who's a Shanachie, right, a storyteller. Um, he has some great stories about her, you know. And when we talk about stories being performed, he's a great example of that, you know, of like how a story is performed, you know. He was also kind of led a campaign to stop the European Union cutting down a fairy tree in Clare to build a road. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, and they actually didn't cut it down in the end. Someone vandalized it like 20 years later, but they diverted the road. Well, they didn't cut down the fairy tree, you know. Which again, living beliefs. These are living. It's living folklore, you know. Um, so Andro is a really interesting case, because he was most likely a witch. He was tried very late in his life. I think he was in his 60s or 70s. But I use a kind of a small quote from him in the book, where he talks about um, being married to the Queen of Elfheim, or having a relationship with the Queen of Elfheim, by whom she begot multiple barns. You know, so she had many babies from of his, um, and so we have the sexual relationship between this kind of fairy queen and the human being. Um, we get the same thing repeatedly with many accounts of witch trials. Isabel Gaudi's is particularly lurid, vivid, when she talks about the dark man lying with the female members of her coven, and he kind of like go from one to the other, like at their Sabbath, um, and was very graphic in describing him, you know. So yeah, not much left to the imagination, and there's lots of that. There's quite a bit of it, but again, you have the same thing with jinn lore. You know, in North Africa, in Morocco, you have a kind of a famous jinn called Aisha Kandisha, who was said to have 30,000 husbands. You know, and people would note someone walking around seemed a little bit kind of out of it, and they go like, he's married to Aisha Kandisha. You know, that there was a madness that came with it. You know, same thing, like you get expressions in language, like, you know, when I was a kid, if someone was a bit out there, they're like, they're away with the fairies. You know, so that was just a colloquialism of it, but maybe it was describing a real thing. You know, so yeah, these are hugely intertwined. Um, in fact, there's a great example, which happened relatively close to where I am now. Like, I found out there was a witch trial in like a town near where I live, and I had this book for ages. This was my own kind of stupidity, right? I had the book because it would have made it into my book if I'd realized this at the time. But basically, um, where around where I live was essentially kind of coastline or beneath the sea 200 years ago, and the very south coast of England, 200 or 300 years ago, the very south coast of England was a malarial zone. And this young lady, she contracted malaria, and she started seeing spirits. So again, not an uncommon thing. People would, their ability to perceive changes. right? And started seeing these spirits, and didn't really know how to manage it. Contacted a local witch to help her kind of figure out what was going on. Witch slash healer was trying to help her get through the malaria and what have you, but this young lady kept seeing these spirits. And one time she's out in the fields and she sees across a hedge. Do I have the book with me now? No, I don't. But she describes, right? This is astonishing. She describes across a hedge, she sees a man dressed in black. Beside him is standing a strikingly beautiful woman, all dressed in green. And she turns to the spirit and she says, "Who is that?" And the spirit says to her, "That's the Queen of Elfheim. It's the Queen of the Fairies." It says, "If you kneel to her, she'll give you gifts." Right. And that's the end of the passage. So we have the man in black standing beside the Queen of Elfheim, in literally a local account, so there seems to be this relationship there, But again, see, this is us doing the labeling: Lord of the Dead, Psychopomp, Fairies, Devil. It's us, you know. So that's where I think that relationship is really, really deeply intertwined.
Ah, Dara, that's amazing. One of the things too, exactly to your point, is in Song of the Dark Man. I love it where you do give, like a paragraph or a specific passage, but then sometimes I love that you share. You're like, hey, we're gonna share this entire tale. Like the way that you present it, it's an element of living storytelling that you bring to us in your book, and I can just hear that in your voice that was such an intentional thing. And one of the things that you just talked about, which where priests, right? Roman Catholic priests would go to some of these practitioners, some of these
Mm-hmm.
witches, for specific solutions. And one of the things that you do is you touch on this kind of dark undercurrent between institutionalized religion and the dark man and the song of the dark man. And to this exact point, one of the things that you touch on, and we are recording this actually around St. Patrick's Day, of course, is you touch on, and I'd love for you to elaborate on this. How is the song of the dark man and the figure, the
Mm-hmm.
pattern of the dark man, treated in the folklore tradition when St. Patrick, the legendary St.
Mm-hmm.
Patrick, arrives? And you specifically mentioned in the book about this struggle of chaos and nature, but within a
Yeah.
Christian framework. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So this is it leans into so many kind of aspects of things around around folklore, mythology, around kind of the trickster element to the dark man, and kind of how he can influence culture, or random sequence of events, right? But there's a whole sequence of events that the dark man on, and as he's described in there's two versions of the same story that I talk to in the book around the birth of Oisin, right? So Oisin is Fion's son. So Oisin literally means little deer, right? And which we'll get to, but essentially, Oisin is half fairy. His mother is Saif, and how Saif comes to Fionn is entirely instigated by the Dark Man. Now, in these two different versions of a story, he's referred to as, I think, as the Black Magician of the Men of God, or the Dark Druid or the Black Druid, that kind of language. So again, we find the black appellation. Now the Black Magician of the Men of God is a really interesting name, because the Men of God is a reference to the Tua de Danann, right? That's who the Men of God are, right? And so he is the magician of the Men of God. Now that pulls in another character, but I'm not going to muddy the water at this point. But But essentially, we have the black appellation. Now, what happens is Fionn is out hunting deer, and he is he comes across this doe, and his hunting dogs won't take the doe down. They're like licking the doe's face, so he thinks this is strange. So I will take the doe back into my fort, into my dune, and that night his bedroom chamber door opens, and in walks the most beautiful woman he's ever seen. He's instantly enraptured by her. He's like utterly besotted, and she's the most beautiful woman he's ever seen. And it's Saifa, and she describes being in fear of her life of this dark druid. And there's a quote I give, and she talks about him, right? And she describes him as like looking up from the river. He sees me from the sky. He sees me from the woods, right? So she kind of describes this omnipotence, of this dark man, and but she kind of lets slip that one of the dark man's servants said, if you get inside Fionn's court, you'll be safe from him, right? You'll be safe from his magic. So now, bear in mind, Fionn means blonde, bright, white, So we have this counter force where the dark man's magic can't get in, right? And it's undone. So she turns back into her human fairy form. So they fall deeply in love, and they have a child. Sorry, got ahead. So they fall deeply in love, and they have a wonderful, wonderful, passionate time together. There, Fionn is called away to perform his kind of knightly duties, to defend Ireland against some marauding Vikings, and he goes off to battle, and so Saivo kind of waits kind of at the fort gate or kind of ramparts to wait for him to be returning safely from battle, and then she sees him coming up the pathway towards the fort by himself, and she runs out of the fort to greet him, and as she comes just to embrace him, he transforms into the dark man. He produces a hazel wand which touches her on the head, turns her back into the deer, and she's never seen again. And Fionn wanders Ireland for 7 years looking for her, heartbroken. And he comes across this young boy, and he recognizes the countenance, looks familiar as his hair color, but it looks like Saiva. And he describes, I was in a faraway place beyond the mist, where it was always, it was summer, and he's describing, kind of fairyland, Tir na Nog. And I was with this deer, and the deer would always tend to me and look after me. And then sometimes this man in black would come, and sometimes he was kind, and then he would scold the deer. And he sent me here, right? That's Oisín. Oisín meaning little deer, right? So, and there's some older versions of that where of that story, right, where actually Saiva is called it's a marginal quatrain in the Book of Leinster. And like the stories of Oisín's conception go back to the 12th century at least, and but Oisín's mother in that earliest version is called Blai Darragh, but she was in the form of a deer when he was conceived, which is an entirely different version of the story. But what happens here is Oisín grows up into a fine poet and warrior, and he's a well-respected member of the kind of the Fianna warriors, right? So again, think Knights of the Round Table, and they're out hunting deer. They do. I mean, the Fianna, the root of the word Fianna is Fia, which means deer, right? So there's deer were big, and we'll see why kind of deer are big in this. It comes to the fore in a bit, but essentially, they're out hunting again, and down in the southwest of Ireland, and out of the west comes this woman on a horse, and she's kind of rides across the lake. So she's a magical woman, and she introduces herself of I'm I'm Neve Kinor, and I'm here for you, Oisín. Basically, you're going to be my husband, and I'm taking you back to fairyland. And Neve Kinor is it, it basically means Neve of the head of gold, like so blonde hair, strikingly blonde hair, right? So, and so Oisín, he heads off with her, and he spends 3 years in fairyland. They have three children. Then he longs to come back to Ireland, so she lets him go back, but on the premise that he must not touch the soil. That is the taboo. If he touches the soil, disaster will happen. Anyway, he comes back to Ireland. He doesn't recognize the place. He can't find the Fianna. The heroes are gone, right? And he comes across three workers on the road, and they have a big rock they're trying to shift, and they can't move it, right? So and this is signifying their kind of they're shrinking from the age of heroes. They're too weak to move this. So Oisín leans down to from a saddle just to kind of toss the boulder out of the way, and as he does so, he tosses the boulder out of the way. His saddle belt snaps, and he falls to the ground. And as he does, he transforms from this, noble, statuesque warrior into this frail old man instantaneously. He ages centuries. So everyone's in a kind of confused by this, and this is some sort of devilry. So he's taken to St. Patrick, where to kind of basically explain what the hell's going on here, right? And this kind of has this leads to kind of what's kind of known as the arguments, or just Patrick and Oisín in I think it's Lady Gregory's version of the book of like the Tuatha Dé Danann, those stories. So there's kind of like modernized versions of the collection of books. So like the Fenian stories are found on Column na Shanarach, or the colloquy of old men, and that they go back to at least the kind of the 7th century. Certainly, kind of fragments of the language do, and that it's a far older linguistic tradition. But it's made up of 3 manuscripts, 2 from the 15th century, the Book of Lishmore and Laud, 610, and then another from Killiney in County Galway or County Dublin. Sorry, Jesus, what am I talking about? But there's modern versions of that have been translated, and kind of mainly by kind of Anglo-Irish folklorists, in the late 1800s. But anyway, what happened with this is that there's this kind of debate between Patrick and Oisín, and it's really interesting because you've got a half fairy being debating with the patron saint of Ireland, right? So how does that work? And bearing in mind that these pieces were all essentially originally written down, transcribed by Christian monks in Ireland, so there was a far more flexible understanding of kind of the complexities of the spirit world. There was dual practice essentially. You got loads of Irish churches that have Sheila na gigs in the walls. Like that kind of stuff exists. That's for those people who aren't familiar what a Sheila na gig is. Like it's a very graphic depiction of a crone woman holding open her vulva. So it's these things were in churches or in church walls, often occulted, turned to the side, that kind of thing. But they were very, very, obviously pagan origin. So it gives you an idea that kind of the Christianity that was existing then was very different to the Christianity that kind of came post-famine, right? Kind of post-famine, it became very much Romanized. Pre-famine, it was underground. There was penal laws. So being a Catholic was, extremely challenging to say the least. But we have a half fairy talking to St. Patrick and actually doing really well, because the crux of it is that Patrick is saying, well, your Fenian brothers and comrades in arms are dead long ago, but they're probably in hell because they didn't have the word of God. They hadn't accepted the word of God. And Oisin was replying to this, going, well, these are noble heroes, with the greatest of virtues among people. How could they? What kind of God do you have if they put someone like that in hell? And this is how it was going, and like accounting quite well for himself, which again kind of shows that conflict and tension in the monks that would have been transcribing this. And at one point, I think he loses his temper and he says something on the lines of like calls the monastic society like clerks and bell ringers, and where I'm my former self, I'd take heads from shoulders and all this kind of stuff, which is brilliant. But we go all the way back then to kind of the instigated start of that story, where the Dark Man was in pursuit of Saiva, who he wanted to marry, but she chose to marry Fionn, and he sent her to Fionn through his servant, saying, if you go there, the magic spell will break, which causes Oisin to be conceived and then born. Right, that starts the domino that allows the slipstream for the Dark Man to exist in the modern world, for all this magic to exist in the modern world. Oisin represents the bridge between the age of magical heroes and the Christian age, which I find astonishing. It's like these kind of like millennia of links to so his story still exists.
Yes, and Dara as well. To that very theme of a bridge, I think people reading your tome, I mean, I certainly did walk away with this undeniable impression, especially looking at the history of Ireland, for example, about how so many of these themes and so many of the notes, if you will, of the Song of the Dark Man exist to this present day as a subtle undercurrent, something that has endured, transformed with institutional religion, like Christianity, for example. And you touch on so bridges that I had no idea even existed up into this present day, including something that you touch on, and this has always stuck with me. In terms of that theme of encounters with the Dark Men, can you share about this example of the Puck Fair held in modern Ireland in County Kerry that always just sticks with me? Can you, for listeners who might be hearing about this for the first time, why is this such a good example of very ancient themes that exist in modern Ireland?
It's a wonderful thing. So the Puck Fair is happens in Lunasa. So mid-August, all the way down in a town called Killorgan in County Kerry. And essentially what it is a wild billy goat is captured off the mountain, right? And these things they have big old horns, we're talking kind of like 3 foot of these curly horns, not curly around, but curling back, right? Big shaggy things. And what happens with this is that the locals capture one of the goats, a wild goat. They bring him down to the town it's a 3-day festival. They don't know when this festival started, right? It goes way back into the deep Irish antiquity. God knows when this idea started. I love it though, because it's so mad and feral. Like, I love that it exists. It's fabulous. So they capture this wild goat, and they have a platform erected in the town on a kind of a trailer that they can move around. It's like a kind of 15-foot platform, and at the top of it they have the goat. The goat is crowned King Puck, so king of the town, and has a crown placed upon it. But not only that, there is a Queen Puck, who is usually kind of a 13-year-old girl from the local school, and she is married to the Puck, symbolically there. And like every year you have these photographs, and why I'm laughing is because I never thought this was weird until I actually looked at it in a different way. Because you grow up and you're like, yeah, we marry a goat, it's totally normal, what are you talking about? And there's always a photograph in the Irish Times around that time of like kind of the girl puckering up to the goat, right? And if you just Google Puck Fairy, you'll find tons of these images, right? But what's going on in that, like, and like it is as folk horror movie as it sounds, right? Like that's exactly what it is. So what's happening is that it's the end of the harvest. It's Lunasa. So with we've established we've survived another year. We've got the food for the harvest to get through the winter, and it's a remarriage. So we're setting up right relation with the wild again, in the form of the goat, right? So the most important asset of the town is the young girl, on the cups of womanhood, who's going to carry the next generation forward, you know. So there, it's a symbolic marriage to get that kind of right relation. So fertility will continue. That the harvest will be good next year. It'll be secured. That's kind of what I think is going on there. But the word puck is associated with a lot of things, like the kind of the it's cognate to so many things. So, for example, I mentioned puka, that type of spirit, which is cognate to the Cornish equivalent of like bucca. So the one of the core spirits that say the coven that Gemma Gary works with, at least publicly from what I've seen in books, is Bucca Dove, Bucca Du, as it's pronounced in Cornwall, I believe. So you literally have the same kind of entity of the name. But the puck turns up as a fairy in France. You see it as place names like Puck Lane, where there might be something that had happened there that got the name of a fairy, or these famously kind of like trickstery fairies. I think is it Midsummer's Dream? Puck is
Yep.
there as
Yep.
well. There,
Yep. Exactly.
So they're cognate to all of this, like and not far from where that town is there's the Paps of Anu, these two mountains that look like breasts, and they have cairns on top of them, so they look like breasts with nipples as well. Like it's and that you got the embodiment of the goddess in the land there. I mean, like County Kerry down there is a wonderful place, beautiful place. But like they've a lot of those really old Gaelic traditions have survived, like on St. Stephen's Day after Christmas, it's like called the Wren's Day down there, and they have like a full on Wren boy festivals, where they dress up in straw masks and straw outfits and kind of parade around the town. That's an old tradition. That's Wren, as in the bird. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it's living stuff, living traditions.
Oh, this is great. This is actually, Dara, this touches on something that I would love if you'd like to elaborate more on this, or even read a passage. You catch fire in the book so many times, and in one of those areas, it's where you talk about, I think it's on pages 71 and 72, where speaking exactly to that point about the topography of the dark man, this kind of catalyst of change, this kind of rewilding of one's own consciousness and connecting to these ancient traditions. You share, quote, and I think this touches exactly what you were just sharing about. Quote, our first temples were caves, deep wombs within the earth, end quote. And so you touch on this importance of rewilding, of reconnecting.
Mm-hmm.
And you have just wonderful points that are just your prose, the way you kind of infuse it has this energy to it. Can you share a little bit about the importance of rewilding, and also how, as you say in the book, modern technology, institutionalized religion has kind of severed this connection? If there's anything you can share, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. I know the bit you mean. I mean that was probably the most intense chapter. Like when I talk about being connected to creative energy, like that's what was happening with this book. You know, like for me, I mean, I don't want to sound pompous or anything, but well, it's not really pompous. It's like the best stuff probably had the least to do with me, if that makes sense. You know, like that creative energy that was coming through was really kind of the the force behind it, you know, and like that kind of lyrical language. Um, but yeah, no, I'll talk to that now. Do you want me to read it out or
I whatever you'd like. I would love it if possible, or even an excerpt. I mean, but if you'd
yeah,
like to read the whole thing, I think listeners would love it. I think that'd be great. But
I
I will leave it to you,
yeah,
sir.
yeah, okay. Well, like the I think there's a good passage here where um when I talk to kind of like the importance of the cave um is highly symbolic in the sense of well the goddess being embodied into the landscape. But there's another layer to it, which is there's an image. There's an image in a cave in Dordogne, um, a cave called Grotte de Gabelou. I can never pronounce French very well, but it's called The Sorcerer, and it depicts uh, a horned, animal-headed figure with a beard and rear legs bent to look like a human being. That's one cave, but there's a more famous equivalent of it, which is it's in the cave of Trois Frères in Ariège in southwestern France, and this is an image that it's approximately, I reckon it's like 13,000 BC, and it's a composite being, right? So it's carved as well as in size. It's in size carved and then painted to a degree as well, but it's of uh, this being that has a kind of an owl's face, antlers, bare paws, and male genitalia. And Margaret Murray, she she believed it was the depiction, the first depiction of a deity in on the earth, right? So this the sorcerer, and I propose that this represents an awful lot of the characteristics of how the dark man manifests to witches, right? But if we think about the importance of getting into a cave, deep into a cave to create some art at that period in history, you know, there's no head torches. And the entrance to that cave is actually submerged. So it must have been a hell of a difficulty to get in there, to have such meaning, to then create a piece of art in there. But I, what I propose is that our the later tomb, the passage tombs and cairns of the kind that we find in the Boyne Valley are the descendants of the cave painters, um, who are replicating that type of environment, that type of structure. Um, and the most notable of those tombs are kind of Newgrange, Nouth, and Douth in the Boyne Valley. And on the winter solstice, the rising sun enters the chamber of Newgrange, and at sunset enters the chamber of Douth. As the solar phallus enters the vulva of the earth, impregnating it for life to begin again after death at winter's lowest point. To the pre-Christian Irish, Ireland was a living goddess embodied in the landscape and its glens and caves her vulva. The most evident example of this embodiment of the land is the Paps of Anu, a pair of breast-shaped mountains in County Kerry. Christianity's virgin birth to a celibate god severed copulation from female sexuality in particular, removing it from its rightful place of veneration to a place of revulsion and fear. This tragedy led to a desacralization of the earth, which, combined with monotheism and the demonization of the dark man, is catastrophic. Humans become separate from nature, and we, like Fomorians, are given license to shape nature to suit ourselves. Thus, the vulva cave became the hellmouth, changing from a source of wonder and the threshold of creation to a place of corruption and spiritual danger. Nature, no longer sacred, becomes our subordinate and its soul demonized. Worse still, we shape our bodies through the empty artifice of technology as we are hollowed out of meaning by modernity. our backs are off us hunched, our shoulders round. We once watched flights of migrating birds in search of auguries. Now we watch trending feeds on Twitter, a feed that offers no nourishment. Eyes that once scanned the sea's horizon no longer look up from a phone. We have utterly abandoned the natural world.
Ugh, Dara, that you just hit right at the heart of so many. Oh my goodness. Just I remember reading that and just I had to read it. I had to pause. I had to reread that passage. Can you can you share to that power? I mean, you let me rephrase that. So you are shattering, really. Is that your kind of aim here? Is to really illuminate and draw attention every single reader like, hey, you're part of a living history. And some of these trends, the eerie blue glow from a smartphone, the just malignant gravity of dopamine scrolling on social media, these things can have a real power to detract from the element of rewilding yourself, of reintegrating yourself. Would that be at least somewhat approaching what you're talking about?
Yeah, yeah, they are a barrier. They're a distraction. You
Hmm.
know, like we have a as moderns, we have a really like disconnected sense of our own place in the environment, of our own place in our our, our abode, where we live, the landscape we live in. Like we're we're generally super disconnected from that. And the lights from mobile phones, like in a very literal way, like they just disturb your kind of circadian rhythm and what have you, um, and something that is absorbing your attention, that is capturing kind of your imaginal world, um, is is to be treated with caution, like and that's one thing that I kind of took from this experience is that, like, I have limited my time on social, and my contributions to social, um, because it's a time vacuum, and it stops me from doing other things that are probably more beneficial to me, and that might be different for whoever, like, but um, I think it's has many good things. I'm not kind of, if people do what they want to do, I'm not going to lecture them on it, but it's in my opinion, it's stopping us from kind of being aware of kind of where we actually are, and being in the moment, and when I talk about kind of that rewilding, it really is about kind of unlearning that kind of stuff, but almost like returning to kind of like a prima materia, like a feral state, you know, like and like, and when we talk about kind of that push against orthodoxy and authority, if you think of it this way, a human being in their original state would be deemed illegal, you know, like you have to register, you have to do this, you have to do that, like a an organic human being, like from, you know 1,000 years ago, would be, you know deemed as having kind of some significant legal challenges ahead, you know. So like it's that's how divorced we are from our relationship with just nature, you know. And really what I'm talking about is that you're not going to hear its voice, you know. If you've got real distractions like that in front of you, you're not going to hear its voice. um and it's easier to hear in the wild.
Ah, gosh, I never thought about it like that. Well, that's another thing from speaking with you and reading your book that I'll never look at in the same way again. That, in the most natural state possible in today's modern world would be a huge puzzling, confusing, and problematic, quote unquote,
Yeah.
thing. Wow.
Yeah. I remember long ago, like seeing a story of like a homeless guy just went and built himself a lovely cabin in the woods, like in a big forest in the UK. And the council came and tore it down and chucked him back on the street. And I remember thinking, like, what kind of obscenity is that? You
Yeah.
know, you can't just live on the land. I mean, it's, no, I don't want to paint a picture that it's always been cosmic. It's not.
Right.
there's it's like a life is always had brutality in it. But it just struck me that kind of like being in the wild was illegal.
Unbelievable.
Mm.
When in reality, um, in true integration, it's the exact opposite. It's that by pushing away these kind of habit fields and these
Mm.
ways of
Mm.
just compressing. I always think of like there's this poverty of consciousness, if you will, in modernity. There's
Mhm.
this squeezing of everything that we used to enjoy: long walks, a sunset,
Yeah.
just getting out there, taking time with a ritual, incanting, and it's compressed down to a
Mhm.
a scrolling feed somewhere digitally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, okay. So, Dara, so this goes to a wonderful theme that you bring up in the book, which is if you do embrace that, the dark man can guide you through the cave, as you say, quote, to the dark womb within and have us, quote, stand on the edge of the cold furnace of creation, which I just absolutely love that phrase. And you say that one of the primary ways that the dark man in folklore, in today, and in modernity, that the dark man will do this in many ways by offering us a choice. And you say, quote, change or collapse, persevere or suffer, end quote. And so when it comes to this choice aspect, I think it's so fascinating. And
Yeah.
like, so yeah, could you share like what are things that people might
Yeah.
misunderstand about this choice? How can we best succeed or navigate in this choice? And what happens if we resist this choice or this
Mhm.
path being offered to us?
I suppose it's kind of a choice in inverted commas, isn't it? Really.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but so I think about it really as being in like being called to do to do something that is a potential fate for you, right? As an individual, like when uh the call to witchcraft, the call to creativity. Um, Now, those can be fairly subtle things, or they can be more impactful and kind of like a direct experience that people have that is life changing. Um, but there can be a real kind of resistance in that transformation, but sometimes fear. It's makes sense, and I say in the book is like, it's not necessarily for everybody, and like actually, turning your tail and running isn't isn't the necessarily the wrong thing to do, you know. Um, but for some people, if they keep resisting it, when that change that they're being pushed towards is obvious, right? But it's like with most things, the thing that you have to do to conquer the fear or deal with the challenges to face into it and kind of walk through it, that's usually how it goes. You know, that's something that can really tear people up. And we can fall back into destructive patterns. And that's kind of what I was talking to earlier about, like, you know things like self-medication and addiction. It can really destroy people. And I know that's not news, but this is what I'm talking about with these experiences can be so intense that they can break people, because they don't know whether they're coming and going, or they're so terrifying, or what have you. um and those things can have like a long tail, you know like which is why I think a lot of shadow work is important, you know, because you're going to face into your flaws. you know, uh,
Dara, that was to your point right there. That was one of the big misconceptions that I had that you really broke so wonderfully in Song of the Dark Man, which is, uh, oh, if I have a relationship where I establish a connection, then this relationship can augment current patterns or current things that I have. It'll somehow make it better. But you turn this immediately on its head because you say that the Dark Man, instead of doing that, which it could do, but the Dark Man is also a trickster who you wonderfully say,
Mm.
quote, shakes the snow globe of order, ensuring novelty for all, end quote. So can you talk about you again so wonderfully shattered my misconception on that. How can you elaborate more on how is the trickster facet of the Dark Man, quote, the cutting edge of chaos, end quote. And you even share about the Pied Piper story, which I
Mm.
wasn't even making that connection before. So that's, yeah, anything you can share on that would be great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it's the it's the whole concept of kind of like stopping stagnation, right? Of like allowing new things to come out, right? And often for something new to exist, something that has become stagnant or old has to go. Um, but there's always some kind of resistance to that, and like the tricksters is an interesting one because it's often kind of a bait and switch, or maybe there's kind of a moral code, moral question in there as well. Um, but often, sometimes some of it just seems to be kind of like there's no necessarily kind of like great, Moriarty level plan. Like Loki just causing chaos all the time. Like absolute madness. But just to make sure it was always changing. That's almost what the point of it is to keep the change going, keep the keep the world turning, so it doesn't stagnate. And also, like, I come back to this a couple of times, is that authority is undermined. You know, um, the Pied Piper example is an interesting one. And the the thing I kind of really like about that story is that, I mean, when did it happen again? Was it the 12th century? I can't remember.
Oh,
Um,
I think so. I'd have to let me I can check as
it's
well, but centuries.
1370. Yeah,
Yes.
so the earliest written version of that is in 1370, and
Mm.
it's an end note in the copy of an old prayer book. Um, but basically, it describes Hamlin as being overrun with rats, and they tried everything, they can't get anything to work. So this mysterious Pied Piper arrives, apparently very strikingly handsome, and dressed in these strange pied clothes, and is the owner of this silver flute, which again is an exceptional thing to have, like as a wandering minstrel. You're not going to have a highly valuable and extremely sophisticated instrument, but so it's we're finding out kind of this something up with this guy. This is this, and it's silver as well, so it's denoting kind of fairyish magical qualities. Then he plays the instrument, and his song leads the rats away. So he demonstrates his mastery over animals. Um, Now this is all based on a contract he has with the town's mayor. So remove the rats, he'll get paid. Simple. He goes to meet the mayor to reap his rewards, and the mayor basically stiffs him, and kind of gives him a tiny fraction of what was originally agreed. And so he does the unthinkable, and does the same trick again, plays a song, and this time it's the children that follow after him. And it's a punishment so horrific that we're still talking about it centuries later. But there's some interesting details to that story. Is that there's a mountain near the town of Hamlin, and it was called Caligari, right? So after the site where Christ died. Now, there's beliefs that actually was the site of pagan practice there. So we find kind of like the center of a religious practice, pagan religious practice, is then superimposed with the name of Calgary, denoting kind of the terrible place where Christ died. There's also kind of a cave that they go into. There was one child who's said to be kind of lame, who couldn't keep up with the other kids. The Pied Piper opens the door in the mountain and they step through, and he sees kind of amazing land, and then the door slams shut and they're never seen again. So we get the kind of they going into the cave, the underworld thing again, but also that mountain cave probably was a seen in a far more positive light, but then it becomes the place of the death of Christ, the hell mouth again. You know, we see that kind of switch in relation to areas. So he totally destroys the authority because the authority was corrupt, right? He gets rid of the rats, but also the children are gone. So like everything is completely changed. Now, there's another story that I talked in the book, which is about Spring Heel Jack. And this was this kind of weird Victorian bugaboo that could breathe fire and was some sort of devilish character that would could jump 12 feet high and jump over carriages. And this Victorian this Victorian kind of villain was kind of captured in kind of the Penny Dreadfuls at the time, these little comic books. But it was a real thing. There was a number of accounts of women being assaulted, and they described being touched. His touch was really cold. Would scratch them. But what I found really interesting, and I think it personifies the trickster thing quite well, is that at the time while this was happening, I mean, this is like in the 1830s. Britain was the biggest imperial power in the world. You know, the sun never set in the British Empire during this period, and one of the kind of the justifications of empire was this idea of like Britain is good for the world. You know, we're bringing civility, we're bringing science, and you know those kind of ideas. Yet at the same time, at the heart of the empire's capital, people were being terrified of this supernatural story of this spirit bounding over walls and attacking people, breathing fire. And almost just to really underline the point is there was a number of sightings of Spring Heel Jack at the Aldershot garrison, which was again the kind of the center of military might for the British Empire. It was like garrisoned about 13,000 soldiers at all times. And there was a couple of accounts of attacks on sentries where this like Spring Heel Jack come bounding out of the darkness, smack a sentry across the face, and like bound away. You know, like and like there was literally shots fired at it. You know, and like so it's showing the lie through that. You know, she's showing the lie that empire is based on. You know, it's like the devil has followed the rural people into the city, and you know. And even in the kind of in the cups of modernity and the modern age, or the industrial revolution is very much well in gear at this point. Then you have this strange being bounding around London, and it went on for years, and it was even outside of London as well. But like it went on for a long time, you know. So it's that trickster is almost like showing the absurd, showing the kind of like the weakness in the strong, you know, or you know where those inversions are. You know, it's very good at doing that. Like think of like what happens to those people who saw that. Their worlds are totally different. You know, we're in the age of science and rationality. Oh yeah, I just saw a being jump 12 foot over a carriage, you know, while breathing fire. Like they all become, then those individuals all become like nodes for the supernatural. And re-enchantment.
Yes. The re-enchantment, the rewilding, as you talk about. I mean, it's this. It's kind of like the old adage that we don't choose our beliefs. You know, it's like you don't choose like I'm going to weigh two options. No, if you're near a carriage and you see a 12-foot bounding fire, you don't
Yeah,
choose your beliefs at that point. You are completely subscribed to
exactly.
this.
Yeah.
Ah, that's such a great point there, and I love your emphasis both here and in the book on that challenging of authority via the fingerprints of the dark men, on the exposing what is counterfeit, either in the culture or in specific illusions that
Mm.
kind of the culture might tell itself. And to this very point, Era, in the book, speaking of this kind of big picture outlook, can you elaborate on your argument that you make that the dark man is a culture changer on a macro level specifically, and this
Mm.
this really blew my mind. You trace the thread from Aleister Crowley to his follower, magician and rocket
Mm.
scientist Jack Parsons, and even mentioning Oppenheimer. I mean, these are fascinating threads that you're tying together. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, yeah. I am. So, kind of what I was talking to is when Crowley kind of receives the Book of the Law in Cairo. He talked about a scene of um, hearing the voice come over his left shoulder from the corner of the room and kind of describe the kind of the smoky figure. I mean, there was one. I mean, I think I do make the point in the book of like he's in Egypt and like never mentioned jinn. It's like this is a jinn king. Anyway, but that's by the by. But the that being the kind of the first domino that sets a course of events in place where um, Crowley works with the voice of Iowas um, in that sequence. He he later writes in the Equinox of the Gods. He gives an in-depth account of his encounter with the voice, stating it came over his left shoulder from the furthest corner of the room. And then in magic, in theory and practice, he's very direct in saying Iwas is the devil, Lucifer, Satan. He's kind of that's his comment on it. So that takes us up into kind of like around kind of the 1950s, where Jack Parsons, who was a founding member of JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which was transferred to NASA in 1958. Well, he was one of the people who invented kind of like modern rocket technology, and he would passionately recite Crowley's hymn to Pan, while he was doing these rocket tests. Now, of course, Pan is another one of these horned gods who embodies the therianthropic figure. He's part man, part goat, or part wild animal, and is another one of these wild spirits, these wild gods. We find them all the way throughout, Ceranos, have been other ones, but he's reciting a hymn to Pan, low Pan, um, in his own magical practice. He's writing with Crowley and what have you. So we actually find the influence of magic in the creation of modern technology, and then weirdly, Oppenheimer. I thought it was very clever when I put in this Oppenheimer quote, but then their major movie came out, which kind of spoiled my reveal. But he recites a passage between passage from the Mahabharata between Prince Arjuna and his charioteer, who's Lord Krishna. And I think in the quote, Oppenheimer says it's Vishnu, says to Arjuna, but Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu. And basically, Arjuna's resolve falters. He's it's at the battle of Kurukshetra, and he is faced with his enemies, who are also his cousins and friends, and in the great this great battle, and his resolve falters. And basically, Krishna says to him, he gives this beautiful speech, but tells him it's his, this is the meaning of his dharma, it's his duty. This is your fate. So go and do your fate. Go and do your fate as best you can. You know, um, which kind of takes us back to the whole, answering the call, right? Even though it's not easy. Um, is then like there's a fabulous play version of the Mahabharata, which I love, by Peter Brooks, and Channel 4 did an epic like 6 hour version of this, the Mahabharata, and the passage between um, Arjuna and Krishna is so poetic and beautifully written. It's really worth looking at. But the interesting thing is that Krishna can mean black, you know, can mean swarthy, and he's depicted being blue, quite a lot. Um, and he's an archetypical mischievous trickster. So he was a libidinous boy god. He was always seducing the village girls, the Gopti girls, and yeah, he teases and dances with the milkmaids, driving them mad with love in the town of Vindravan, where he was, which I've been to. I've been to the place where Krishna was supposed to have been born, and been born in Mathura, and then grew up in Vindravan. So yeah, I've been to the temples associated with him. Fabulous places. But it's incredible stuff about Krishna. There's one story I talked to him in the book about his mother, yeah, confronts him saying, you've been eating dirt, right? Um, she was told that, or your son has been seen eating dirt, and he was just like crazy kid, doing all this mad stuff. And Yashoda goes out and kind of confronts him, saying, have you been eating dirt? He denies it, obviously lies immediately. Again, trickster element. And she asks him to open his mouth, and he opens his mouth, and inside his mouth she can see the entire universe, planets, nebulas, the entire universe. That's when we're getting into that kind of idea again of like the non-dualistic metaphor of all is contained within one.
That is such a consciousness elevating experience. I mean, it really, that's to your very point. I mean, reading Song of the Dark Men and the across cultures, across space time, the different dots that you're connecting,
Mm.
Dara, is truly something that I think leaves, and I know this has been the case, obviously, for so many people who have read your book. It really leaves you in this, I guess, well, I suppose to quote Shakespeare in Hamlet, but as a wonder wounded hearer, somebody who is really just standing there and saying, okay, there are these beautiful patterns. There's this entire ancient tradition, and by rewilding, by reconnecting, you can plug into that current again. You can really do that. And I think this leads us, Dara, to getting personal a bit, because in the first part of the book, for the listeners who definitely check out the links below, listeners, to support Dara on Patreon, and also to pick up your own copy of The Dark Man, both of which are excellent. In the second half of the book, Dara, you get personal, and you not only share, and I definitely want to get to your own very personal individual via vision, but
Yeah.
then also working with others regarding the Dark Man and rewilding. But you also have a wonderful menagerie of stories and accounts from other practitioners
Yeah.
from various traditions sharing about their own experiences of the Dark Man. So,
Mm.
can you give us, Dara, some of the broad strokes in the second part of the book about this incredible collaboration that
Mm.
you've shared of other people's encounters with the Dark
Yeah.
Man?
Absolutely. I'm just before I do that, in terms of
Please.
the technology element, I should have made this point. Like, when you talk about rockets or atomic energy, like, you could argue these are dreadful things. It's like, but this technology, it's transmoral. It's how it's used. It's not, you know corrupt or evil in its essence. You know, it tends to be human beings that make the dreadful decisions. But I felt I should have made that point. But yeah, no. As I said to you, like when I was interviewing people, and the dark man would come up, as part of their story, and I'd be like, well, that's the thing again, like and that's kind of how it all happened. So what I wanted to do is to share, you know, for those who would be willing to share, because these experiences are very personal, but they're what happened to them, what it meant to them, and look at it from different perspectives. Um, and I was very lucky in that some fabulous people were willing to share their their accounts, and some of them, they're very very different, of how the dark man kind of manifested in their lives. Um, where Shudi Porter is a hereditary witch, and she recalls seeing the dark man when she was a very young child. And it's a very big presence in her life. Um, and you know, she talked like quite explicitly about um, like the dark womb, going to the dark womb, and what that feels like. Being in a cave, this kind of infinite water, and where she experienced a healing. Where he took her to heal her. And it was in a psychopompic sense as well. She was in surgery that had gone, was it surgery? But she had a medical emergency anyway, and things weren't looking good. And he came to take her, and kind of say, where are you ready? She was like, no, I want to go back. And then feeling the sensation of the pain returning to her body. It's an astonishing account. Um, Elise Ursa is the first account, and she talks about um, creating a deck of cards, like in like really rapid succession. She was just really intense kind of painting process, creating this deck, or this tarot card deck called Blood and Ink. And I was chatting to her recently, and she was saying she actually hadn't done any art in like 20 years, but then had gone through this intense experience. She was having a bunch of dreams of this dark figure, standing over to her over in her room, telling her to paint these cards. Um, and she did. And now her career's changed. She's like moved into art as her main pursuit. Like it's called her back to that creative thing. But here's a really strange layer to this: is she was seeing this dark female figure, kind of like under a veil, repeating a name, right? And she was like, it's one of those Irish names, like unpronounceable. I can't remember what it was, and kind of we zeroed in. It was Sive, which is the name of Fionn's fairy wife. There's very few references to the Dark Man in folklore, and that is the main one. She had no idea of that at all, So like this is, when you get your bell ringed like that, it's you just can't talk your way out of that. It's like, oh, this must have been that, and there was even more kind of intense ones than that. But also kind of there was one really interesting account about Glastonbury tour, which was by Jesse, who's been on the show, Jessica Mitchell. And this is a really interesting one because it's not a dream. She wasn't a magical practitioner. No hereditary witchcraft in her family. She went up to Glastonbury tour at in the middle of the night with her friend. They kind of misjudged the time of how long it was going to take. They went in they did the whole kind of circuit rather than just the tour. I went up there, and then this 12-foot black figure appeared. I felt very, very frightening, very menacing figure. But it was like 2D, and asked them for a cigarette, asked them for a cup of tea, and it's just all this real weirdness. And then eventually, kind of like, it all stopped, and they kind of went on their way. But their whole world's changed because they've come up against the total supernatural. But of course, the tour is said to have um, a king under the mountain, Gwyn ap Nudd, who is this Welsh psychopomp who appears as, I think it's the black figure with the white face, you know, and um, the tour is happens to a lot of people. Like the stuff of the tour does go down, you know, and it seems to be this dark man energy. In fact, before I had my experience, I was at the tour about 6 weeks before it. But you know, I know of another friend who has a kind of a Gwyn ap Nudd kind of fairy lover um that came from that. Um and yeah, it's the tour comes up a couple of times. You know, there's a stone above the land there, which is said to be kind of one of his testes, one of Gwyn ap Nudd's testes. Um, Megan Rose, she went to the tour. Gwyn ap Nudd turned up as well, you know, later for her in dreams. So these are real things, you know. Orion Foxwood gives an account of going to the crossroads as a child to talk to the Dark Rider, you know. Peter Gray and I'll kiss this Dimesh to talk about like the wildness, you know, and you know that you're going to get this almost like pre-verbal stuff, you know, in the cave, you know, it'll bring you back to the cave with this type of energy. They gave their kind of experiences with kind of like the digital barrier to getting close to things, to hearing the voice. And David Beth talked to Master Leonard and kind of that aspect of things. But there are, which was a specific detail as well, you know, like Master Leonard is associated with the Black Sabbath, the witchcraft, and like there's a couple of details that are a little bit graphic. I hope it's okay to talk to them, but in the cases of Isabel Gowdy, they talk about kind of intercourse with the Dark Man, where they describe him as being ice cold within them. So they would describe it as being like almost like spring water within me, so cold. Spring Heel Jack, when he touched people, they said it was again ice cold. And there's a reference to Master Leonard, which talks about his sexual fluids being cold as well. So you start to kind of get this kind of cross reference of points of this seems to be a recurring reference to that. But yeah, a huge amount of magical experience there, you know. So I was very lucky that people were interested in sharing, and the point of it is, you know, if this kind of happens to you, you know, and people do write to me about saying, look, this has happened to me, and kind of like actually reading your book has made me realize, you know, I'm not going crazy. There is something to this. I am scared. You know, your book hasn't made me feel any less scared. But at least I know that there's a thing here that I can kind of recognize or start to figure out how I'm going to approach.
Absolutely. And this bringing together this you know collection of wonderful you know practitioners sharing about their own direct experience, unfiltered, with various facets of the Dark Man.
Yeah.
One of those important nodes, of course, is your own story, and
Yeah.
it absolutely blew me away. Of course, you know, listeners, pick up your to get the full account, pick up you know your check the links below and get your copy of Song of the Dark Men. But can you give us some of the broad strokes, Dara, some of the
Mm.
teasers about, because I mean this was an incredibly, just I can't even imagine, overwhelming
Yeah.
experience in many ways. But what are some of the broad strokes you can tell us about your own direct
Yeah.
experience?
Yeah. I like I was doing like pretty basic you know magical work, you know, like of doing an exercise called the middle pillar, which would be familiar to many. And um, and during that exercise, um, just I'd got kind of 2 weeks into kind of a daily practice, and while I was doing kind of a number of different meditations and kind of daily devotionals, that kind of stuff, um, while I was doing the middle pillar, weird stuff started to happen. I mean, not necessarily. Oh God, well, it did get very weird, but like, I mean, initially it was just like things like I had a poster of like the tree of life on the wall, which I was meditating on. When I was doing that meditation, the middle pillar of the energy work, one corner of it always started to peel off the wall. I was like, well, that's okay. I'm noticing that, and that happened like every day for like a week, and then I was doing that's the last time I did it. So you can give that's the impact it had on me, right? I stopped all magical practice when this happened. I was doing the middle pillar, was about kind of halfway through when um my whole kind of internal world changed, and there's just this like hyper realistic, really vivid vision of like a fiery eye staring at me, which then the pupils started to turn into this like angel, but a silhouette of an angel, like, and really like quite quite big muscular angel, and I could feel the heat from it. Like it was like really, really intense. And it flashed a sigil to me. It spoke to me briefly. And then it took off vertically. And as it did, I was like going with it. It was like it had that real kind of like, roller coaster when your nervous system reacts to like a roller coaster or going up lift too fast. That kind of really rushed feeling, just shooting straight up. I was going up with it, and it was so vivid and real that I mean, it was just I stopped everything. I didn't speak about it for about 3 months. Um, I only I only actually mentioned it to Elise Ursa in the book because she's a good friend. Um, and she was like, oh, only I know you, I would say you're bullshitting, like that doesn't happen during that. And I'm like, I'm like, I have no point of reference. All I know is this what happens. Um, so she kind of put me in touch with Michelle. I was really lucky to be surrounded by these amazing women who just helped me through it. And we spent about a year doing lots of meditation, lots of practice to work out where we were. And straight away it was Dark Man, and what was coming through was that magical practice that had kind of switched on that kind of part of me that was connected to that energy. And it kind of culminated with myself and Elise and Shuli out in the southwest of England on the Dartmoor kind of national park, um, being in a very oh, we were making our way to a stone circle to basically kind of call him, and it was like something out of a horror film, just like rolling mist everywhere, so we didn't go to the stone circle we'd originally intended to. We ended up in a very small other kind of megalithic stone circle, and we set a scene, did our framing for the ritual, kind of protective stuff, the barriers we wanted to ask. Elise had suggested like Jason Miller's kind of 3-question protocol, so we did that, and I we did a couple of different incantations, and I did some stuff, Gemma Gary stuff from The Devil's Dozen, and we were really just this rolling wind and mist everywhere. And then when we finished, the mist just like the wind stopped and it went deathly quiet. We heard a baby cry. There was like dogs barking. I mean, Shuli had called in Hecate to be kind of the kind of intermediary, so so it was appropriate. And I asked my questions, and then the last question I asked was like, "Well, what do you want?" And I just said, "Right." Um, and and the voice is so hard to describe. It's just like sounds like dozens of voices, all layered together at the same time, and like, and it's like it's non-local. It's just all you're in your head and around your head. And that was the Saturday. We finished that. We got back to, I think, our lodgings at about like 12:45. So we've been out kind of at midnight, and kind of slung some cards to kind of say, okay, is where are we at with this? Done some divining. Had a very large glass of wine, and then 2 days later, I had the editor of this book basically call me from the publishers. So I sent him a speculative. I had a response from Joshua Cutchin's publisher. Joshua very kindly introduced us, and he wrote back to me on that Monday saying it's not quite for us, but I suggest you try this individual at Inner Traditions. Now I'd sent a submission to Inner Traditions. I'd only sent 2 submissions, but I sent one to Inner Traditions, and he got back to me immediately. In fact, Kate emailed me back on, "What's your number?" Right, and I'm like, "What publishers?" This is like, wow, okay, and that was it. So the Darkman said right on Saturday, and by lunchtime Monday, the wheels were in motion for my contract. And actually, this book didn't get through the submission. They like which they had words with afterwards. Apparently, how dare they? But yeah, like literally 2 days later, he had opened the way, 100%, because he wants his song to be sung.
Indeed. And you have certainly vibrated that, I think, to so many people. And I think, again, just hearing you describe that, where your world is shattered, your consciousness is rearranged, like I don't know, like a Darkman version of Tetris. Everything's getting rearranged, and then all of a sudden, then reshattered again. And that's so wonderful. And then finding out at the end, well, I was going to say this is a spoiler, but I don't think it reveals. But I was blown away at the end of the book, right? When you're sharing exactly in this part, where you're like, then at least for me, it just dawned on me, oh my gosh, like this entire tome is part of that offering, is part of that personal, individual, idiosyncratic connection that you have with
Yeah.
the Dark Man. I mean, it just came full circle. Was that kind of the intent behind that as well, is to show how it's like a positive Ouroboros, it's just like constantly
Yeah,
feeding
yeah.
you.
Um, it, it it was one where I wasn't sure if I was going to put that chapter in, because it was pretty personal, but yeah, just I felt it would just tie it together, like it was the right thing to do for the book, so I did. Um, but also, people were very good to share their stories with me, and that's why I felt I should, do the same, But it made sense, like.
Absolutely. That's again, my mind was blown. The challenging, the kind of positive challenging to question, to embrace it's such a powerful thing. Darragh, we only have 3 more questions for you from listeners, and then of course I definitely want to talk about ways that listeners can, of course, if they don't already, support you and pick up a copy of the book and find out, you're always working on something, what other projects you are working on. But we have a listener question for you from Gabrielle Shearer, and Gabrielle saying, the book describes multiple personal accounts and perspectives, and though they differ, Mr. Mason points out that the dark man occurs across cultures, geographic areas, and time. However, Gabriel says there are also points in time or even places. Are there points in time where the dark man is particularly active? It's hard not to feel that the world is at a crossroads in many ways. So, is there anything you can share about
Mm, yeah.
the activity today? Yeah.
So I would say that when where the world is wild, you know, he has a place, you know, and in terms of places, I mean, the crossroads is the most kind of well known one, but look at the place names. It's like we mentioned, like that kind of Puck Lane. You know, you'll find places like the Devil's Glen or the Devil's Hill. You know, and that kind of stuff. It's like honestly, the clues are in the maps. If you go to Google Maps or whatever, and you just put in devil, you know, in whatever country you are, you will be astonished with the amount of places that will be named after the devil. And those places tend to be things where just high strangeness happens, you know, or they're associated with some sort of pagan or witchcraft stuff, you know. But it's absolutely there. Like there's a place near me called Puck Lane, you know, like in there's some old sighting, some you know that this is where these places get the names. Um, and then in terms of times in history, like I said, what the wildness, but we're kind of we're you know you get crossroads in history as well, where things are prevalent. Look at the time we're in now. Like it's so many strange, absurd, terrifying things happening all at once. You know, like I've made this point before in my podcast, but like just looking at kind of like the what's happening in the celestial world at the moment. Like we have so many comets, like the news talking about, rather there's a city killing meteor apparently with a 50% chance of hitting the earth. Like that stuff just didn't exist in the news when I was a kid, you know, or like there's an eclipse. It's like every 2 weeks is an eclipse. So you know, like it's just like it just seems to be this kind of really amplified, accelerated time with a very busy sky, you know, and like I'm joking to a degree, but like these things are generally associated with big change, you know, and like sometimes catastrophe, you know, and I think we are in a time now where the veil is thinner, you know, like I mean, I'm saying that from personal experience, like, but that so it might be my own kind of bias there, but like there was a huge explosion of interest in kind of magic and the occult, you know, like 5 years ago, and a lot of ideas that would have been very slipstream are now kind of more mainstream, you know. So I would say we're probably in a time of crossroads now, across you know time of change now, for sure.
That's wonderful. And actually, Dara, this next question goes right to
Mm.
Gabrielle's question and your point about the crossroads. We have another question for you from Naomi C. Taranas, who's asking, Naomi saying, I've really been wanting to learn more about this. And here is presented in a book and a podcast interview. I'm just as excited as you are, Naomi, that Dara's here. My question, Naomi says, is one of practical application. As an omnist, I don't discount the deities or spirits of any
Mm.
religious practice. Without getting too political, Naomi says, there are things going on in the U.S. done in
Mm.
the name of the Christian God who is reportedly at war with the devil.
Mm.
Would it be within the realm of possibility, Naomi's asking Dara, to work with the devil to gain an ally against those who claim to fight against him?
I, I mean, I'm sure it would be possible to do so. You know, whether it would work or not would depend on kind of how the dark one perceives that. Really, you know. But he's a trickster. Who knows? Do you know what I mean? Like, uh, but yeah, I'm sure it's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of goes to the multifaceted, just
Mm.
there are many different aspects of the dark man
Mm.
that you can embrace, work with, hear
Yeah.
that call, tune into, if that would be fair.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so.
Yeah. Well, the last listener question we have for you, Dara, is from Anna Victoria Esquivel again. And Anna's asking and saying, within our magical communities, debates often arise around the topic of separating deities that could have similar correspondencies or overlap. For instance, some will argue that the Roman Mercury and the Greek Hermes are quite
Mm.
distinct. But now it's very interesting to me, Anna says, that an entity such as the Dark Man can appear in such distinctive forms and have delimitations
Mm.
under certain names or titles, while at the same time representing an all encompassing dark
Mm.
entity with blurred boundaries. So Anna's asking, Dara, how do you think it's helpful for us magicians and sorcerers to adhere to these delimitations? And how
Mm.
is it helpful to conceive separate beings under one same, archetypal identity?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question.
Mm.
I remember talking to Phil Hine, and he was kind of basically saying, there's that people either um they see the similarities and tend to cluster them together as being the same thing, and rationalize it that way. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly what I do, Peter, or Phil, brother. But I think that I think number one is to think about, well, what speaks to you. What do you feel vibes with you? Like if it is it is it like Hermes or Mercury, like which vibes with you, and then kind of work with that way. I mean, if you ask me, do I think they're distinct or the same? I'm like, they're very similar. Like they like those two in particular. You know, and the psychopompic qualities, the communication, the the elements around kind of boundary and travel, like all that kind of stuff is very similar. So this again comes down to, what do we think kind of a god is? And I tend to think that the Indian way of viewing things, the Hindu way more specifically of viewing things as avatars, is very helpful in this light. So Krishna and Vishnu are separate, but Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu, and represents the same qualities, but in a different way. And I think that's how I think that's a better way of being able to understand that, how those things connect, and can exist in a similar way, that they're separate, but they're not separate, you know. Um, I don't mean to be talking in riddles like that, but I do think that kind of, that the avataric way of viewing these entities and energies is a helpful way. Like, and I talk to that in the book. I talk about a relationship between like the black magician of the men of God, is as a name that the dark man is given, seems to refer to the Dagda, within the Tuatha Danann tradition. And interesting, the Dagda has a staff that the top of the staff can give life, and the bottom of the staff can take it away. And he's very similar to Odin in a lot of ways. In fact, one of the names for the Dagda is like all Ahur, right? Which literally is weirdly cognate, because like it sounds like all Ahur is basically Ahur's father. So it sounds like all father, like it's a weird cognate. It's like the father, high father, So it's very similar. The spear and the staff, very similar. So, um, and he is the best magician. So in the second battle of Mytora, the druids of the both rival camps are going at each other, and Dagada basically says, "Everyone, chill. I'm the best. I'm better than all of you. I'm going to do it." As a magician, and that's where like part of that connection is, and then you've got Dondov, who is this Lord of the Dead, who has an otherworld kingdom, like and in fact one of the names for fairyland is like Don's land, so it is another name for the fairy kingdom. And when we talk about similarities, so remember the story, Cybus turned into a deer, and that's how she ends up in Fion's fort, and that's the sequence of events ahead. That's not the only version of that story. There's a similar bit where two of the Fianna are out hunting, and they are tricked into coming to Don Dove's land of the dead, because he's turned another fairy woman into a deer to trick them, to lead them into the fairy kingdom. The exact same story. And then you have is a poem called Fafland in the metrical Dinshackness. And that tells a story of Aiga, who is turned into a deer by some evil spirits and then is chased to her death. So we have this kind of fairy woman into a deer motif happens all the time. And of course, when the Dark Man turns up to Isabel Gaudi, she quotes directly. Sometimes he turns up as a ray or a deer, and a ray is a reference to roe deer. So we have that kind of inversion as representation, as Joshua Cutchin says, which I found extraordinary when I read that reference. That sometimes he would arrive in the form of a deer. I was like, blew my mind. It was astonishing. But they all have similar characteristics. So how I see them is avatars, of the same current.
Such a what a great way to look at that. To the avatar effectively allows you to both differentiate or emphasize a certain facet of a particular, being such as the dark
Yeah,
man, a particular pattern, but it also doesn't divorce it from the cohesion of the overall whole. So it maintains the holisticity, but it allows you to emphasize specific facets of that or specific emphases. If that's somewhat fair, I don't
yeah,
know, but
exactly that. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Oh, that's so great. That's so great, Dara. Well, thank you so much. I definitely, as we wrap up the podcast here, obviously, listeners, you must check out the links below if you haven't already to pick up your own copy of Song of the Dark Man. It is wonderful. I really can't recommend it enough. Also, to support Dara on Patreon, check out the links below. And to support Dara not only on Patreon, but to check out, and as I know many, many, many listeners are familiar with, Dara's excellent Spirit Box podcast as well. So, Dara, can you share with us? I think a mind like yours, much like Peter Mark Adams, you're always working on something. You're always doing something, traveling somewhere. So, can you give us any hints, in addition to supporting you, of course, and your wonderful podcast and your book? Can you give us any hints in terms of future projects,
Mhm.
things that you're thinking about? Anything and everything would be great.
Sure, sure. Well, I think uh, Peter and I have had some discussions about maybe developing a piece together. I'm sure we'll do something together for sure. Um, but I think one of the pieces that I'm thinking about now is kind of around all these kind of mass traditions that we have, particularly in kind of in Europe. So all the way from like Sardinia to Finland, from Central Europe out to the western peripheries of Ireland, you've got these mask traditions that tend to have a kind of a play, a story in them, and some of them have a real kind of Christian overtone, but some of them are astonishingly kind of talking about kind of again this tension between the wild and civilization, or kind of like um and like all these kind of crazy horned masks, and there's a connection to the puck with this as well. There's like in Finnish, the 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 word for like Father Christmas or Santa Claus is like the like some, translates to something like the Yule Father, right? Something like that, right? But there's another character which is associated with him, which is kind of a trickster that goes door to door and like basically you have to sing a song or he'll play a trick on you. Okay. And this thing's called a nuki putti, right? And I can't help but do like a silly pronunciation of that, but like you want to see this word, it's got like, so many eyes in it. But it essentially is this Yule goat, is what it translates as, right? So it's somehow a sidecar to the kind of the Santa Claus or Yule Father character. But is it again? It's a horned figure that's stooped over. You got a similar thing with Krampus in like Germany and Austria, and but there's heaps of these different types of plays. There's loads in Sardinia, these masked figures, loads in kind of the Iberian Peninsulas, and they're fascinating. So what I was thinking about looking at that is what's going on there. Is there a story to tell there? And I think there is, but that's a bit off. That's a bit off. I think there's a couple of other things to do first.
Well, speaking of masks and the next act, if you will, I know myself and the listeners, Dara, will certainly keep our ear to the ground for any updates or future projects that either solo, of course, your individual research or collaborations, that whatever you set your mind to, I'm sure will be certainly very illuminating and well worth it, well worth the read and well worth the deep dive. Darragh Mason, we appreciate you so much. Thank you for taking the time and sharing your wisdom on the podcast today about the Song of the Dark Man and about your own background. I truly appreciate you taking the time and sharing this with the listeners today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, and thank you very much for hosting me. I've been a fan of you and your work for so long, so it's really nice to be here. And great to chat with you.